3,966 penalty minutes. It is a record that stands as a monument to violence. But the cost of that record was absolute isolation. The entire league hated him. His own teammates feared him. Tiger Williams lived as a wild beast among men, a weapon to be used, not a brother to be embraced. He walked through his career in a crowded arena, yet he was the loneliest man in the building. David Williams was born into this freeze on February 3rd, 1954. He was born into a community of survivors. These were the children of the Depression, farmers and laborers who worked the earth and the oil, people whose hands were permanently stained with grease and soil. It was a stoic society. In Weyburn, a man's worth was not measured by his wealth or his words. It was measured by his threshold for pain. It was measured by how much burden he could carry without complaining. If you were hurt, you didn't talk about it. If you were sad, you swallowed it. If you were afraid, you hid it behind a mask of stone. Silence was a virtue. Suppression was a survival strategy. This was the atmospheric pressure that pushed down on David from the moment he took his first breath. He grew up in a world where vulnerability was a liability, where admitting you were hurt was an invitation for the world to hurt you more. He wasn't born Tiger. That is a crucial distinction. He was just David, a boy with wide, curious eyes and a heart that beat with the same innocent rhythm as any other child. He played, he laughed, he dreamed, but he was a boy living in a culture that was systematically designed to strip that innocence away. His father was a Welsh immigrant, a hard man who worked hard and expected his sons to do the same. The ethos of the Williams household was simple. You work until the job is done, and then you work some more. There were no shortcuts in Weyburn. If the snow needed shoveling, you shoveled it. If the car needed fixing, you fixed it. If you got hit in the mouth, you spit out the blood and you kept moving. This was the first lesson, learned long before he ever laced up a pair of professional skates. Emotional amputation. Pain was not a signal to stop. Pain was merely a sensation to be ignored. This was the soil in which the seeds of his future madness were planted. The ability to dissociate from physical suffering, the ability to turn off the alarm bells in the brain that scream danger, these were not flaws in Weyburn. They were gifts. They were the tools you needed to survive the winter. And then there was the ice. Hockey in a place like Weyburn was not a hobby. It was not a pastime to fill the hours on a Saturday afternoon. It was a religion. It was the civic heartbeat. It was the only splash of color in a world of monochromatic gray and white. For a young boy like David, the rink was the sanctuary. It was the only place where the world made sense. The local arena was a barn, smelling of stale popcorn, cigarette smoke, and the sharp metallic tang of unwashed gear. It was freezing inside, often colder than the air outside, but to David it was warm. It was home, and the boy could play. David Williams was not a clumsy giant. He was not a lumbering ox on skates. He had a gift. From a young age, he possessed a natural fluid grace on the ice that belied his rugged upbringing. He had what the scouts call soft hands, a delicate touch that allowed him to cradle the puck, to feel it on the blade of his stick as an extension of his own nervous system. He could shoot with accuracy. He could see the ice. He could anticipate the flow of the game. On the frozen ponds of Saskatchewan, under the vast open sky, David Williams was an artist. He loved the sensation of speed, the sound of steel carving into fresh ice, the pure, unadulterated joy of scoring a goal. In those early years, he wasn't looking for a fight. He was looking for the net. He was a goal scorer. He was a playmaker. He was a hockey player in the purest sense of the word. But innocence in the prairies is a perishable commodity. The system was already watching. The system was already sorting the wheat from the chaff. In the local rinks of Saskatchewan, skill was admired, yes. Being able to skate fast was good. Being able to shoot accurately was good. But being tough, being mean, that was currency. That was the gold standard. The atmosphere of youth hockey in Western Canada in the late 1960s was not the sanitized, safety-first environment of today. There were no concussion protocols. There were no seminars on sportsmanship. It was a gladiatorial training ground. The coaches were often men who had been hardened by the same unforgiving life, men who believed that hockey was a preparation for war. They looked at a boy like David Williams, talented, yes, but also fiery, also stubborn, and they saw something else. They saw a spark of aggression. They saw a boy who didn't back down when he was challenged. And instead of nurturing the artist, instead of protecting the goal scorer, they began to fan the flames of the soldier. It started slowly. A slash here, a hit there, a shove after the whistle. When David used his skill to score a goal, he received a polite clap. But when he used his body to hurt someone, when he threw an elbow that knocked an opponent flat, the bench erupted. The coaches slapped him on the back with a little extra vigor. The fathers in the stands roared their approval. That's it, David. You let them know you're there. Don't take any guff from them. Make them bleed. These were the whispers that began to infiltrate his ear. This is the moment the corruption begins. It is subtle at first. It feels like praise. It feels like belonging. You are a young boy desperate for approval, desperate to be seen as a man in a world of hard men. And you realize with a sudden chilling clarity that violence is a shortcut to respect. You don't realize that you are being groomed. You don't realize that they are stripping away your humanity layer by layer and replacing it with a function. You are becoming a tool. A hammer does not get to decide what it hits. It only knows that it is loved when it strikes the nail. David Williams began to realize that his ticket out of Weyburn, his ticket away from the freezing wind and the life of manual labor, wasn't just in his hands. It was in his fists. It was in his capacity for cruelty. He was entering his teenage years, a volatile time for any young man, but for a hockey player in Saskatchewan, it was the crucible. He joined the Swift Current Broncos in the Western Canada Hockey League, WCHL, widely considered the toughest junior league on the planet. This was the Wild West. This was a league where brawls cleared the benches routinely, where the police were sometimes called to the arena, where players were carried off on stretchers, not as an exception, but as a rule. And it was here, in the brutal cauldron of junior hockey, that David began to recede and Tiger began to emerge. He didn't lose his skill, not yet. In fact, he was a star. He was scoring goals in bunches. He was one of the best players on the ice. But he found that his skill was inextricably linked to his aggression. The more he fought, the more room he had to skate. The more terrified the other team was of him, the easier it was to put the puck in the net. He began to cultivate a reputation. He wasn't just fighting to protect himself anymore. He was fighting to be seen. He was fighting to create a persona so terrifying that it would open doors that talent alone could not unlock. He learned to feed off the hatred of the opposing crowds. When they booed him in Regina or Saskatoon, he didn't feel shame. He felt powerful. He felt important. He didn't see that this was a trap. He didn't see that by accepting the role of the villain, by embracing the moniker of the Tiger, he was isolating himself from the rest of the human race. He was building a wall of hostility that would eventually become a prison. But the rewards were immediate and intoxicating. The scouts from the National Hockey League began to circle. They came to the freezing arenas in their wool coats, notebooks in hand. They watched him skate, and they nodded at his stride. They watched him shoot, and they noted his release. But when he dropped his gloves and pummeled an opponent into the ice, that was when they underlined his name. They weren't looking for a poet. They were looking for a policeman. They were looking for nuclear deterrence to protect their million-dollar investments. David Williams, the boy who loved to score goals, was about to be drafted. But they weren't drafting David. They were drafting the Tiger. He stood on the precipice of his professional career, staring down the barrel of a future that promised fame, unaware that he was voluntarily stepping into a meat grinder. The weapon had been forged. Now it was time to take it to the market. The 1974 NHL Amateur Draft was a cattle auction conducted over telephone lines. There were no podiums, no flashing lights, just men in closed rooms viewing players as raw livestock to be acquired, broken, and utilized. When the Toronto Maple Leafs selected David Tiger Williams in the second round, 31st overall, it should have been the apex of his young life. It is the moment every Canadian boy dreams of while shivering on a backyard rink. The call to the show, the call to the original six. But stripped of the romance, viewing the transaction with the cold eye of history, it wasn't an invitation to play a game. It was a conscription. Toronto didn't draft David Williams because they needed another goal scorer. They had Daryl Sittler. They had Lanny McDonald. They had artists. What they lacked was a nuclear deterrent. The NHL in the mid-70s was entering its darkest, most violent epoch, the era of the Broad Street Bullies, the Philadelphia Flyers, a team that was essentially winning championships by bludgeoning their opponents into submission. To survive in this ecosystem, you couldn't just be good, you had to be armed. The Maple Leafs drafted Williams because they read the scouting reports from the prairies. They saw the penalty minutes, they saw the aggression, they saw a young man who treated his own body with a reckless disregard that bordered on pathology. They drafted a weapon. Moving from the flat, open silence of Weyburn to the crushing noise of Toronto was a culture shock that would have rattled anyone. But for Williams, it was a descent into the belly of the beast. He was a prairie boy, used to the wind and the wheat, suddenly dropped into the big smoke, a metropolis of concrete, media scrutiny, and corporate pressure. He walked into the Maple Leaf Gardens for the first time, and he felt the weight of the ghosts. The Gardens was not just an arena, it was a cathedral. The air inside was different, thicker, heavier, smelling of popcorn, stale beer, and 60 years of history. High above the ice hung the banners of the legends, Apps, Kennedy, Bauer. These were the gods of the sport. And down on the ice, skating in circles during the warm-up, was the new recruit, the boy with the wild hair and the wilder eyes, trying to figure out where he fit in the pantheon. This was the moment of the bargain. David Williams stepped onto that ice and looked around. He saw the way Daryl Sittler handled the puck. Magical, effortless, as if the rubber disc was magnetized to his stick. He saw the smooth, powerful strides of Lanny McDonald. He saw the elegance of Dave Keon. These men were technicians. They were masters of their craft. But Williams possessed a sharp, cold intelligence. He looked at the roster and did the math. The league was full of guys who could score 20 goals. They were replaceable inventory. But a man who could score and terrify the entire opposition? That man was rare. That man was indispensable. Somewhere in the quiet of his own mind, he made a calculated decision to suppress the artist and sign a pact with the devil. He would become the Tiger full time. He told himself it was just a role. He told himself it was just a job. I will do the dirty work, he thought. I will go into the corners where the elbows are flying. I will stand in front of the net and let them cross-check me in the spine. I will fight the biggest, meanest animals in the league so that Sittler and McDonald don't have to. He framed it as an act of service. He was the bodyguard. He was the sheepdog protecting the flock. But in reality, it was an act of self-mutilation. To ensure his survival, to secure the paycheck and the fame, he had to agree to destroy a part of himself every single night. He had to agree to be the villain. The transformation was immediate and terrifyingly effective. In his rookie season, he didn't just fight, he waged war. He threw himself at opponents with a ferocity that shocked even the hardened veterans of the league. He didn't care if he won or lost the fight. The point was the chaos. The point was to send a message. If you touch my teammates, you have to go through the lunatic. The Toronto fans, starved for grit in a city that often felt too polite, fell in love with him instantly. They didn't cheer for his passing plays. They cheered when he rode his stick down the ice like a witch's broom after a goal, a flash of the showman, the entertainer, the man desperate to be loved. They roared when he sat in the penalty box, blowing kisses to the crowd, his face smeared with blood. They called it heart. They called it character. But they were cheering for a man who was systematically dismantling his own empathy. The management loved it. Harold Ballard, the cantankerous and cruel owner of the Maple Leafs, loved the circus. He saw Tiger not as a son, but as a ticket seller. Violence put bums in seats. The newspapers wrote endless columns about the wild thing. The media created a caricature, a cartoon Tasmanian devil on skates. And David Williams felt the pressure to live up to the drawing. If the paper said he was a wild animal, he had to be a wild animal. If the fans expected a fight, he had to give them a fight. The psychological toll of this performance was absolute. Waking up on a Tuesday morning in November meant your body was aching from the game the night before. Your knuckles are swollen and bruised. You are drinking your coffee, reading the paper, and you see your own name. They are calling you a beast. They are predicting who you will beat up tonight against Boston or Philadelphia. You know that tonight you have to face the big bad Bruins. You have to face Terry O'Reilly. You have to face men who are paid to hurt you. A normal human being feels fear. The instinct for self-preservation screams, "Don't do this. Stay home. Stay safe." But David couldn't stay home, and Tiger wasn't allowed to feel fear. So he had to kill the fear. And to kill the fear, he had to kill the sensitive part of himself. He had to numb the boy from Weyburn who just wanted to skate. He began to build a wall around his heart. In the locker room, he was loud, boisterous, the funny guy, the prankster. He was the life of the party. But this too was a deflection. If he kept everyone laughing, they wouldn't see the anxiety in his eyes. If he kept the volume turned up to 10, he wouldn't have to listen to the quiet voice in his head asking if this was worth it. He was becoming a gladiator in the truest Roman sense. The crowd loved him, but they didn't know him. They didn't care about his long-term health. They didn't care about his soul. They just wanted blood on the sand. And Tiger, desperate to keep his place in the sun, desperate to never go back to the freezing fields of Saskatchewan, gave it to them by the bucketful. But the performance exacted a heavy toll. Fame and money came with the roar of the crowd, but in exchange, he lost the luxury of peace. As the 1970s wore on, the Tiger persona began to harden like concrete. It became a trap. Even when he had the puck on his stick and an open lane to the net, the referees were watching him for a penalty. The opponents were hacking at his ankles. He had typecast himself so effectively that he was no longer allowed to be just a hockey player. He was a prisoner of his own creation. And the most heartbreaking part, the flashes of brilliance were still there. Occasionally, the red mist would clear and David would emerge. He would make a pass that threaded the needle. He would score a goal with a touch so soft it looked like a caress. And for a split second, the arena would go silent in surprise. They would see the player he could have been. But then the whistle would blow. Someone would shove him. The crowd would start to chant his name, baying for a fight, and the tiger would snap back into control. The gloves would drop. The fists would fly. The David Williams, who could have been a star scorer, would recede back into the darkness, pushed down by the necessity of the violence. He had made his choice. He had sold his potential for security. He had traded the art for the war. And as he sat in the penalty box night after night, watching the game he loved continue without him, the isolation began to set in. He was the most popular man in the building and the loneliest man in the world. The weapon was working perfectly, but the man inside the casing was beginning to crack. The narrative of the tragic enforcer usually follows a predictable arc. The player arrives, he fights, his skills erode, and he vanishes into the ether. But the story of Tiger Williams is not a straight line. It is a violent, jagged scrawl that defies the laws of hockey physics. The true depth of his tragedy was revealed when the mask slipped in Vancouver in 1981. By the end of the 1970s, the relationship between Williams and the Toronto Maple Leafs had soured. Harold Ballard, the owner who treated his players like cattle, discarded him. Williams was traded to the Vancouver Canucks, a team on the edge of the continent, a team searching for an identity. For most enforcers, a trade is the beginning of the end. It is the sign that you are a depreciating asset. But for Williams, the move to Vancouver was a strange, bittersweet liberation. In Toronto, he was the circus act. In Vancouver, the coach, Harry Neal, looked at him and made a decision that would create the greatest statistical anomaly in the history of the sport. Harry Neal said, "Go play." He put Tiger Williams on the power play. He gave him ice time. He treated him not as a nuclear deterrent, but as a forward. And in the 1980 to 81 season, David Williams, the boy from Weyburn, who had buried his talent to survive, burst through the concrete of his own reputation. The numbers from that season are staggering. They look like a typo in the record books. 35 goals. 35 goals in a single National Hockey League season. In that era, 35 goals was a benchmark for a star. It is a career year for a first-line winger. It is a number that earns you millions of dollars in a spot on the Wheaties box. That year, Tiger Williams scored more goals than Hall of Famers, like Lanny McDonald, Darryl Sittler, and even the great Guy Lafleur. He was an offensive juggernaut. If you only looked at the goal column, you would think you were looking at the stats of a sniper, a finesse player, a man who skirted the perimeter and picked the corners. But then you look at the other column, the receipt. 343 penalty minutes. In the same season that he was one of the league's top scorers, he was also its most violent offender. He sat in the penalty box for nearly 6 full games worth of time. The grainy footage of those 35 goals reveals the truth. They were not pretty. They were not the gliding poetic goals of a Mike Bossy or a Wayne Gretzky. They were garbage goals, scored in the trenches. Williams scored them by going to the place where the maps of the ice are marked with warning signs, the front of the net. This is the burning house. It is the area of the ice where the defensemen are allowed to cross-check you in the spine, where the goalie can hack at your ankles, where the puck flies at your face at 100 miles an hour. It is a place of pure physical punishment. Most goal scorers visit this area. Tiger Williams lived there. He used his soft hands, those hands from the Saskatchewan ponds, to deflect pucks, to bury rebounds, to shovel the rubber past sprawling goaltenders. But to get the chance to use those hands, he had to offer up his body as a sacrifice. Every goal came with a bruise. Every point came with a payment of pain. He would score, ride his stick in that wild, frantic celebration, a release of pure, unadulterated joy that looked almost manic. And then on the very next shift, he would drop his gloves and fight a heavyweight from the Philadelphia Flyers because someone looked at his teammate the wrong way. The mental gymnastics required to sustain this level of performance are unfathomable. The focus required to score a goal in the NHL demands soft muscles, calm eyes, and a slow heart rate. Conversely, the focus required to fight a man who wants to kill you demands tension, rage, and a racing heart. You need tension, rage, a racing heart. You need to be an animal. Tiger Williams had to switch between the artist and the animal shift by shift. Sometimes second by second, he was playing two different sports simultaneously. He was the scorer and the bodyguard. He was the beauty and the beast in one battered jersey. The tragedy of the 1981 season is not that he failed. It is that he succeeded too well. He was selected for the NHL All-Star Game. He flew to Los Angeles to play alongside the gods, Gretzky, Dion, Esposito. He walked into that locker room, and he belonged there. His stats said he was one of them. For a brief shining weekend, he was David Williams, All-Star. He wasn't sitting alone on the bus. He was sitting with the royalty of the game. But even in the All-Star game, he couldn't escape the shadow. The media didn't ask him about his shooting percentage. They asked him about his fights. They treated him like a novelty act, a gorilla in a tuxedo. Look at the goon who thinks he can play. They couldn't accept that the violence and the skill could coexist in the same soul. And deep down, Williams knew it too. He knew that his 35 goals didn't buy him freedom from the violence. In fact, they enslaved him further. Now, the expectation was impossible. The coaches didn't just want him to fight. They wanted him to fight and score. They wanted the maximum output from the machine. Tiger, we need a goal. Tiger, go hit that guy. Tiger, wake us up. He was burning the candle at both ends and in the middle, holding a blowtorch to the wax. This season, which should have been his greatest triumph, was arguably the accelerator of his destruction. It proved to him and to the world that he had the talent to be a star. He could have been a 50-goal scorer if he hadn't had to spend 300 minutes in the penalty box. He could have been a legend for his hands, not his fists. But the system wouldn't allow it. And perhaps by this point, Tiger wouldn't allow it either. The addiction to the adrenaline of the fight was too strong. The fear of losing his edge was too deep. He believed the lie that he had told himself years ago, I am only valuable if I bleed. So he continued to bleed. Even as he scored, he bled. The 1980-81 season stands as a melancholy what if. It is the proof that the goon narrative was a lie. He wasn't a thug who got lucky. He was a thoroughbred horse forced to pull a plow through a minefield. He did it with a grim determination, producing a harvest of goals that no one expected. But the effort was breaking his back. When the season ended, the stats were immortalized. 35 goals, 343 penalty minutes. It remains the most confusing, impressive, and heartbreaking stat line in hockey history. It is the perfect numerical representation of a man at war with himself. But seasons end, the ice melts, and the body remembers. The goals were celebrated, but the damage was cumulative. The adrenaline of that miracle year masked the fact that he was grinding his joints to dust. He was setting a standard that was physically impossible to maintain. He had climbed to the mountain top, planted his flag, and looked down to realize that the only way down was a long, painful fall. The artist had had his moment in the sun, but the clouds were gathering. The next phase of his career would not be defined by goals. It would be defined by the pharmacy of pain. The 35 goals proved he was human. The years that followed would try to prove he was made of steel, until the steel rusted through. The 1981 season was the summit, and the descent was a cliff face covered in jagged rocks. The glory is recorded in trophies, But the reality was found in the silence of a hotel room at 8 a.m. in Detroit or Chicago, watching a 30-year-old man try to get out of bed. It is a process that takes 10 minutes. The body, stiffened by the adrenaline crash of the night before, has seized up like a rusted engine. The knees, devoid of cartilage, grind with a sound like gravel being crushed. The back, twisted by 1,000 cross-checks, spasms in protest. The hands, those soft hands that scored 35 goals, are swollen into claws, the knuckles buried under layers of scar tissue and fluid. This is the biological tax of the enforcer. The human body is a miracle of engineering, designed for endurance and movement, but it is not designed for collision. It is not designed to stop a 200-pound man traveling at 30 miles an hour. It is not designed to absorb the kinetic energy of a bare fist smashing into the orbital bone. Pain was no longer an event. It was the environment he breathed. There was the sharp stabbing pain of the fresh injury, the cracked rib, the broken nose, and the deep background radiation of chronic agony that woke him at 3 a.m. In the NHL of the 1980s, pain was not an excuse, it was an obstacle, and the league had a specific way of removing obstacles. To stay on the ice, he entered the pharmacy of pain. Trainers became chemists. It wasn't about getting high, it was about mechanics. I need to skate, my knee won't bend. Fix it. The needles came out. Cortisone to reduce swelling, xylocaine to freeze nerves, Toradol to mask the screaming of the bone. They turned off the body's alarm system so the machine could keep running. But when the game ended and the freezing wore off, the debt came due. The pain returned with a vengeance because he had played on injuries that needed rest. This is where the bottle entered the story. Alcohol wasn't a celebration. It was a tool, the only anesthetic available after the trainers went home. You cannot just go to sleep after 3 hours of hyperarousal and violence. So, he drank. He drank to lower the heart rate, to numb the throbbing hands, and to silence the ringing in his ears. It became a cycle as rhythmic as the tides: damage, repair, sedate, repeat. The team knew, the league knew. In many ways they facilitated it. The beer coolers on the bus were always stocked. The flights were open bars. Why? Because a sedated weapon is a manageable weapon. A drunk Tiger Williams was easier to handle than a sober, hurting, angry David Williams. If he was numb, he wouldn't complain about the knees. If he was numb, he wouldn't think too hard about the fact that he was slowly destroying himself for a paycheck. But the most insidious part of this chemical survival was what it did to his mind. The pharmacy didn't just numb the body, it numbed the spirit. To do what Tiger Williams did, to hurt people for a living, requires a certain deadening of the soul. You cannot look into another man's eyes, see his fear, and then punch him in the face if you are fully connected to your own humanity. You have to dissociate. The pills and the booze helped with that dissociation. They created a fog, a buffer zone between David and his actions. They allowed him to float through the violence, a passenger in his own body. He began to lose track of the line between the performance and the reality. Was he drinking because he was in pain? Or was he drinking because he was ashamed? Or was he drinking because he was afraid? Because yes, there was fear. This is the secret that the statues don't tell you. You cannot stare down a man like Bob Probert or Dave Semenko, giants who can crush bone, without feeling a flicker of terror. But Tiger wasn't allowed to show it. The mask had to be rigid. So he swallowed the fear with the beer. He drowned the anxiety in vodka. And when you swallow fear, it doesn't vanish. It ferments. It turns into bitterness. It turns into a hard, cold knot in the center of your chest that never goes away. By the mid-'80s, Tiger Williams was walking a tightrope, On the ice, he was still the fearsome enforcer, the man with the wild eyes. But off the ice, the cracks were showing. The eyes were red-rimmed and watery. The face was puffy, swollen with the toxins he was ingesting to stay alive. The sharp wit, the David who could light up a room, was becoming duller, slower. He was caught in a centrifugal force of destruction, spinning faster and faster. He couldn't step off the ride because the ride was the only thing that gave him value. He was a gladiator who had forgotten how to live outside the arena. He was chemically altering his reality to endure a life that had become unendurable. And the bill for all that numbness was accumulating in the dark, waiting for the day the music stopped to be presented for payment. The pharmacy of pain had kept him on the ice, yes, but it was slowly, methodically, killing the man inside the jersey. The weapon was still sharp, but the hand wielding it was beginning to shake. The romantic myth of the band of brothers, the idea that a locker room is a sanctuary of absolute unity, did not apply here. For Tiger Williams, the locker room was not a home. It was the loneliest place on earth. The true weight of human isolation is not found on a mountaintop. It is found in a crowded room, surrounded by 20 other men wearing the same colors, laughing at the same jokes, yet separated from them by an invisible, impenetrable wall of glass. This was the reality of David Williams's life in the National Hockey League. He was the most popular man in the building, yet he was drowning in solitude. The rejection began in the most mundane of places, the team bus. In the 1970s and 80s, NHL teams spent half their lives in transit. They lived on buses and planes, traversing the continent in a blur of highway markers and clouds. These trips are the heartbeat of team chemistry. It is where friendships are forged in the dark, where trust is built over card games and quiet conversations about wives, mortgages, and fears. But on the Toronto Maple Leafs bus and later in Vancouver, there was a specific unwritten geography to the seating arrangements. There were the veterans in the back, the rookies in the front, the goal scorers clustered together discussing strategy, and then there was Tiger. Usually the seat next to him was empty, or if it was occupied, the distance remained psychological. His teammates were skilled technicians, artists of the ice who worried about their shooting percentage or their contract negotiations. Tiger was the nuclear deterrent. He was the man who kept the wolves at bay. They appreciated him. God, they appreciated him. They knew that without him, the wolves would eat them alive. They knew that his violence bought them the space to be artists, but they could never truly inhabit his world. The disconnect was profound. While a player like Darryl Sittler sat 3 rows away visualizing a hat trick, visualizing the puck hitting the mesh, Tiger Williams sat in his corner visualizing a collision. He had to meditate on destruction. He had to summon the darkness. He carried the burden of the impending violence alone, a singular, vibrating anxiety that no playmaker could share or understand. He was the sin eater. He absorbed the brutality, the hatred, and the physical trauma so that the saints, the stars, the scorers, the golden boys, could remain clean. He dirtied his hands so theirs could remain spotless. This created a profound class divide within the team. There is a hierarchy in sports, not just of talent, but of morality. The goal scorer is the hero. The enforcer is the necessary evil. His teammates would slap him on the shin pads after a fight and say, "Great job, Tiger." But there was a look in their eyes, a mixture of gratitude and pity, and perhaps a flicker of revulsion. They were glad he was on their side, but they didn't want to be him. They didn't want to know what it felt to have your nose reset in the intermission. They didn't want to know the taste of another man's blood in your mouth. They kept him at arm's length. They invited him to dinner, sure, They laughed at his jokes. Tiger was famously funny, a defense mechanism honed to perfection. But there was always a barrier. You don't get too close to the bomb. You don't cuddle with the guard dog. This isolation was compounded by the fact that Tiger Williams was intelligent. He wasn't a mindless thug. He knew exactly what was happening. He saw the way the management treated him differently from the stars. If a star player had a sore wrist, the doctors rushed to him. If Tiger Williams had a broken hand, they taped it up and told him to stop complaining. He was expendable. He was equipment. He was a piece of machinery that could be replaced by another angry boy from Saskatchewan if he broke down. He began to realize that the affection of his brothers was entirely conditional. They loved him when he was bleeding for them. But would they love him if he stopped? Would they love David Williams, the man, if he refused to be Tiger Williams, the beast? He feared the answer was no. So he retreated further into the persona. He became louder, wilder. He turned the volume of Tiger up to deafening levels to drown out the silence of his own isolation. He became a character in a play, reciting his lines perfectly, but screaming on the inside. In a cruel twist of irony, the only intimacy he knew was violence. Human beings crave touch. We crave connection. But for 20 years, the only time another man truly touched Tiger Williams with passion, with intensity, with focus, was when they were trying to hurt him. The grab of the jersey, the punch to the jaw, the wrestling to the ice, this was his contact sport. The physical language of his life was aggression. He spent his career in a crowd of thousands, with millions watching on television, yet he walked a path that was utterly desolate. He was the guardian at the gate, standing in the cold, watching the party inside the warm house. He protected the house. He would die for the house, but he was never truly allowed to live inside it. As the bus rolled down the highway in the middle of the night, while his teammates slept the sleep of the just, dreaming of goals and glory, Tiger Williams would stare out the window at the passing darkness. He was alone with the throbbing in his hands and the ghosts of the men he had hurt, and the realization must have settled in, heavy and cold as a stone. The team is a myth. The brotherhood is a lie. When the gloves drop, you are the only one in the ring. There is a specific ruthless gravity in professional sports. It pulls on everyone, from the superstar to the bench warmer, dragging them inevitably toward the earth. But for the enforcer, for the man whose currency is physical dominance, the pull of gravity is not a gentle decline. It is a crash. A goal scorer can lose a step and still be effective. He can rely on his vision, his experience, his positioning, but a fighter cannot lose a step. If an enforcer is a fraction of a second too slow, he doesn't just miss a play, he gets his jaw broken. The margin for error in Tiger Williams' line of work was not measured in inches, but in consciousness. By the mid-1980s, the invincible armor of Tiger Williams was beginning to rust. The body, that miraculous machine he had fed into the grinder for a decade, was finally revolting. The knees were gone, grinding bone on bone with every stride, requiring hours of icing and anti-inflammatories just to function. The back was a twisted knot of scar tissue and spasms. The hands, those hands that had once possessed the touch of a goal scorer, were mangled. The knuckles permanently swollen, the ligaments stretched like old rubber bands. But the physical erosion was only half the tragedy. The other half was the arrival of the young wolves. The NHL is a predatory ecosystem. Every year, a new crop of young men arrives from the farms of Saskatchewan, the mines of northern Ontario, and the gritty streets of Boston. They are 20 years old. They are 6'4". They are 230 pounds of muscle and hunger. They grew up watching Tiger Williams on television. They idolized him. And now, to make their own name, they knew they had to kill the king. Williams found himself in a position he had never known: vulnerability. He would look across the ice during the warm-up and see a kid who was bigger, faster, and stronger than he had ever been. He saw the lack of fear in their eyes. He saw his own mortality staring back at him. For the first time in his career, the Tiger had to act. He had to fake the confidence. He had to posture and growl, not to intimidate them, but to convince himself that he could still stand in the ring. And the system, which had once treated him like a vital asset, began to treat him like a depreciating commodity. This is the moment the family myth dissolves completely. When you are winning, you are a brother. When you are broken, you are inventory. After his glory days in Vancouver, the nomadic phase of his career began. This is the hallmark of the disposable hero. When you are a franchise icon like Yzerman or Sakic, you stay. You are the foundation. When you are a hired gun, you go where the trouble is. You are a mercenary. He was shipped to the Detroit Red Wings, then to the Los Angeles Kings, then to the Hartford Whalers. That geography traced on a map reveals the itinerary of a man being discarded. Each trade was a little death. In Toronto and Vancouver, he had been a legend. He had roots. He had fans who knew his children's names. In these new cities, he was just a rental. He was the Tiger, brought in to sell a few tickets, to protect a few rookies, and then to be moved along when his utility expired. He lived out of a suitcase. He slept in unfamiliar apartments with rented furniture that smelled of other people's lives. He walked into locker rooms where he was a stranger, an old warhorse looked upon with a mixture of respect and suspicion by kids young enough to be his sons. The psychological weight of this period is crushing. Imagine the loss of identity. In Vancouver, he was the man who scored 35 goals. He was an all-star. In Los Angeles and Hartford, nobody cared about his hands. Nobody cared about his hockey sense. They just wanted the animal. Go hit him, Tiger. Go fight him, Tiger. They stripped away the last vestiges of the artist and left only the thug. He was becoming a caricature of himself, a traveling sideshow act performing the same violent routine for a diminishing applause. And the shame began to curdle inside him. David Williams, the proud man, the skilled player, knew he was better than this. He knew he was being used. But what could he do? The only way to stop the trades, the only way to stay in the league, was to fight harder, to be crazier, to be more violent. He was caught in a doom loop. To prove he wasn't washed up, he had to take risks that his aging body couldn't handle. He fought men he should have avoided. He took hits he should have dodged. He poured more chemicals into his system to mask the screaming of his joints. The Tiger persona became a desperate, flailing performance. He wasn't riding the stick for joy anymore. He was riding it to prove he was still alive. He was screaming at the referees not out of passion, but out of frustration at a game that was speeding past him. The league was changing too. The goon era was slowly, agonizingly giving way to a faster, more skilled game. The dinosaurs were dying out, and Tiger Williams was a T-Rex in a world that was starting to favor the Raptors. In 1988, he landed in Hartford, the Whalers, a team that doesn't even exist anymore, a ghost franchise for a ghost player. He played 26 games, he scored 6 goals, he accumulated 87 penalty minutes. He did his job, he bled, he fought. But the phone calls from the general manager were getting shorter. The pats on the back were getting lighter. The eye contact from the coaches was fleeting. They looked at him and saw a relic. They saw a piece of machinery that had rusted out. They saw a liability. David Williams felt the silence closing in. He sat in the locker room in Hartford, looking at his nameplate, a piece of tape over someone else's locker. and he must have realized that the ride was over. The machine had extracted every drop of juice from the lemon, every goal, every fight, every minute of penalty time, every drop of blood. And now that the rind was dry, it was preparing to toss it into the garbage. He had given them everything. He had sacrificed his body, his reputation, and his peace of mind. And in return, he was about to receive the ultimate insult of the professional athlete, the unrenewed contract. He wasn't going to get a parade. He wasn't going to get a farewell tour. He was just going to be let go. The commodity had expired. The fall was imminent. And David Williams, standing on the edge of the abyss, looked down and realized that he had no parachute, only a bottle and a lifetime of regrets. The lights of the arena were about to go out, and for the first time in 20 years, he would have to face the dark without a weapon in his hand. The end of a professional athlete's life does not happen with a bang. It rarely happens with a press conference, a montage of greatest hits, or a tearful lap around the ice while the crowd chants your name. For the vast majority, and especially for the enforcers, the end is a soundless event. It is simply the cessation of noise. In 1988, the Hartford Whalers released Tiger Williams. He was 34 years old. There was no phone call from another team. The telex machine fell silent. The agents stopped hustling. The league, which had consumed his youth, his health, and his sanity for 14 years, simply turned its back and continued the game without him. Retirement for Tiger Williams was not a liberation. It was an eviction. He was evicted from the tribe. He was evicted from the only world that made sense to him. He was evicted from the singular identity that he had spent 2 decades constructing brick by bloody brick. This was the moment of the void. The structure of the National Hockey League is a militaristic existence. For 14 years, David Williams did not have to make a decision. The team told him when to wake up. The team told him what to eat. The team told him when to get on the bus. The team told him who to hit. His entire life was a rigid grid of itinerary and obligation. It was a cage, yes, but it was a safe cage. It provided purpose. And then on a random Tuesday morning, the grid dissolved. Waking up for the first time in 5,000 days without a schedule was disorienting. He opened his eyes. The sun was shining. The house is quiet, and you have absolutely nowhere to go. There is no morning skate. There is no video session. There is no enemy to study. The silence of the living room was louder than the roar of the Chicago stadium. It pressed against his ears. It was a suffocating, heavy silence that screamed one word: obsolete. He walked through his house like a ghost haunting his own life. He looked at his hands that were swollen, scarred, crooked from 1,000 impacts, and he wondered what they were good for now. This is the tragedy of the specific tool. A hammer is designed to do one thing: drive nails. If you take a hammer and try to use it to fix a watch, it is useless. If you try to use it to write a letter, it is clumsy. Tiger Williams had forged himself into a specific tool for a specific environment. He was a master of intimidation, a virtuoso of controlled violence. But in the real world, in the suburbs, those skills were not just useless, they were illegal. You cannot body check the man who cuts you off in traffic. You cannot drop the gloves with the bank teller who denies your loan. You cannot pin a grocery clerk against the wall to get better service. The instincts that had made him a millionaire, the hair-trigger aggression, the dominance, the physical imposition, were suddenly liabilities. He was a lion, released into a library. He was a war machine in a time of peace. He felt a profound vibrating sense of uselessness. The system had extracted every drop of juice from him, every goal, every fight, every minute in the penalty box. Now that the Rhine was dry, it was tossed into the garbage, and the abandonment was swift. The band of brothers, they were gone. The teammates he had bled for, the men he had protected from the monsters of the league, they moved on. The game doesn't pause for the fallen. The season continued. New enforcers stepped into his role. New sheriffs patrolled the ice. The bus kept rolling to the next city, and Tiger wasn't on it. He realized then that the affection of the league was entirely conditional. They loved Tiger because Tiger was useful. They didn't know David. And now that Tiger was dead, David was invisible. There was no transition program in 1988. There were no therapists waiting to help him decompress from 2 decades of high-stakes trauma. There was no counseling for the adrenaline withdrawal. There was just a handshake and a good luck. The loss of identity was catastrophic. For years, he had introduced himself not by his name, but by his occupation. I am Tiger Williams. I am the enforcer. It was his armor. It was his shield against the world. Now he looked in the mirror and saw a stranger. He saw a man with a battered face, a nose that had been broken too many times to count, scar tissue around the eyes, and a body that moved with the stiffness of an 80-year-old. He saw the wreckage of the vehicle, but the driver was missing. He tried to fill the hours. He tried to be a normal husband and father. He drove the kids to school. He mowed the lawn. He went to dinner parties. But normalcy felt bland. It tasted like ash. It lacked the electric current of the arena. He missed the fear. He missed the respect that comes from fear. In the real world, nobody looked at him with that mixture of awe and terror. He was just another retired jock with a limp, and deep inside the brain of David Williams, the chemistry was failing. For 14 years, his brain had been bathed in a cocktail of natural adrenaline and cortisol, spiked with the artificial highs of painkillers and stimulants. Now the supply was cut off. The brain, starving for its fix, fell into a deep, dark depression. The adrenaline crash is real, and it is devastating. The world seemed gray. Nothing excited him. Nothing mattered except one thing, the bottle. The bottle didn't care that he was retired. The bottle didn't care that his knees were shot. The bottle didn't care that he wasn't on the power play anymore. The bottle was the only thing from his old life that made the transition with him. It was the only faithful friend. And so, the descent accelerated. In the years immediately following his retirement, the drinking changed. In the league, alcohol was pain management. It was medicinal. Now it was existential. He wasn't drinking to numb a sore shoulder anymore. He was drinking to numb the silence. He was drinking to kill the boredom. He was drinking to try and feel something, anything other than the crushing weight of being a warrior with no war left to fight. He sat in his basement, surrounded by the trophies and the jerseys, the artifacts of a dead civilization, and he poured the liquid courage down his throat. For a few hours, when the buzz hit, he could remember the roar. He could remember the feeling of landing a perfect right hook. He could feel like the king of the jungle again. But alcohol is a liar. It borrows happiness from tomorrow to pay for today. And David Williams was borrowing heavily. The depravity of this period lies in the contrast. On one hand, you have the public memory of the hero, the man riding his stick, the all-star. On the other hand, you have the reality of the man on the couch, bloated, red-faced, angry. He began to resent the game. He watched hockey on television and felt a bitter bile rise in his throat. He saw the young players making millions, protected by new rules, and he felt cheated. I paved the road for you, he thought. I bled so you could skate. The shame loop tightened. He knew he was spiraling. He was a proud man, raised in Weyburn to be tough, and here he was, defeated by a glass of amber liquid. He hated himself for his weakness, and because he hated himself, he drank more to drown the voice of self-hatred. His family watched from the shore as he drifted further out to sea. They tried to throw ropes. They tried to call him back. But the riptide of addiction, fueled by the loss of identity, is a force of nature. You cannot reason with a man who is mourning his own death while he is still alive. The tiger was dead, but David was dying. This is the bottom of the void. It is the place where the cheers don't reach. It is the place where the lights are out. It is the place where you realize that the deal you made with the devil 20 years ago has finally come due. You gave the game your body and your soul, and the game gave you a record in a book and a liver that is failing. He was alone in the dark, with only the echoes of the collision to keep him company. And in the silence of that void, David Williams had to face the hardest opponent of his life, the man in the mirror. And this time, he couldn't drop the gloves. He couldn't punch his way out. He had to find a way to survive the piece. But Tiger Williams refused to become the tragic ending that the script had written for him. He refused to let the system have the final satisfaction of burying him. But survival is not the same thing as victory. Survival is simply the act of continuing to breathe while carrying the weight of what you have lost. In the early 1990s, David Williams looked into the mirror of that lonely basement and made a decision that was harder than any fight he had ever fought on the ice. He decided to kill the tiger. He realized that if he continued to feed the beast with alcohol, with anger, with the desperate need for relevance, the beast would eat David alive. He had to reinvent himself. He had to learn to walk in a world where he couldn't hit anyone. He turned to business. He turned to the oil and gas industry, returning to the very earth of Western Canada that had spawned him. There is a profound poetry in this return. The boy who fled the hard labor of the prairies to become a star returned to the hard labor to save his soul. He worked with the same maniacal intensity he had shown on the penalty kill. He wanted to prove to the world, and more importantly to himself, that he was not just a knuckle dragger. He wanted to prove that his brain was good for something other than absorbing punches. He became successful. He became wealthy. On the surface, it looks like the perfect redemption arc. The hero returns, conquers his demons, and lives happily ever after. But look closer. Peel back the tailored suit of the businessman, and you will find the ruin of the gladiator. The body of Tiger Williams today is a catalog of orthopedic disasters. It is a structure held together by titanium, scar tissue, and willpower. He has had multiple surgeries. His knees are artificial. His hips have been rebuilt. His shoulders grind in their sockets. Every step he takes is a negotiation with gravity. When it rains, the metal in his body aches, a physical reminder of the nights in Philadelphia and Boston. The receipt that we spoke of in the beginning, he is paying it in installments every single morning of his life. And then there is the shadow of the mind, the specter of CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy, hangs over every enforcer from that era like a storm cloud. You cannot take thousands of blows to the head without consequence. The brain is soft tissue floating in fluid. It remembers every collision. Williams speaks often with a sharp wit, but there are moments of darkness. There are the mood swings. There is the forgetfulness. There is the short fuse that never quite went away. He lives with the fear that the darkness is waiting for him, that the damage done in 1975 or 1982 is a time bomb ticking away in his neurons. He watches his friends, his former rivals, wither away into dementia and despair, and he wonders, am I next? Is the fog coming for me? This is the survivor's guilt of the enforcer. Why is he still standing when so many others are gone? Why did his liver hold out when others failed? Why did his mind stay relatively sharp when others dissolved into chaos. He walks through the world of modern hockey like a dinosaur in a museum. He watches the game today, fast, skilled, sanitized. He sees players wearing visors, protected by strict concussion protocols, making millions of dollars without ever having to drop their gloves. He doesn't hate them, but he feels a deep, aching disconnect. He looks at the modern stars and thinks, I paved this road with my bones. I bled on this ice so that you could skate on it safely. There is a profound sadness in being a relic. The game he loved, the game he gave his life to, has legislated his existence out of the rule book. The Tiger Williams role no longer exists. If a player played like him today, he would be suspended for life. He is a master of a dead art, a virtuoso of a violence that society has decided it no longer wants to see. So he lives in the long walk home. He attends the alumni dinners. He signs the autographs. He smiles when fans, now old men themselves, come up to him and say, I remember when you rode your stick. I remember when you fought Semenko. He smiles, but it is a tired smile. They are remembering the entertainment. They are remembering the circus. They don't see the cost. They don't see the mornings where he has to sit on the edge of the bed for 20 minutes before his legs will work. They don't see the bottle of anti-inflammatories on the nightstand. They don't see the ghosts that visit him when the house is quiet. He survived the system, yes, but the system took its pound of flesh. It took his innocence. It took his physical health. It took the artist who could score 35 goals and buried him under a mountain of penalty minutes. David Williams is not a tragedy in the traditional sense. He is not a cautionary tale of failure. He is something more complex and perhaps more heartbreaking. He is a man who won the war, but lost himself in the fighting. He is a soldier who came home, took off the uniform, and realized that the uniform had fused to his skin. He is still walking. He is still fighting the urge to let the tiger out. He is still trying to find the boy from Weyburn in the mirror, but the ice is gone, the crowd is gone, and all that is left is the silence and the numbers in the record book and the quiet dignity of a man trying to make peace with the violence that defined him. Ultimately, the legacy always circles back to the number 3,966. It looks like a high score in a video game, but it is a graveyard. It represents weeks of isolation in a wooden cage, wiping blood from his nose while thousands screamed his name. It is the final receipt for the transaction Williams made. He gave them the villain they needed, and in return, they gave him a record that stands as a monument to his own destruction. But the true tragedy of Tiger Williams is not found in the fights he won or lost. It is not found in the penalty minutes. It is found in the ghost of the player he was not allowed to be. The memory of 1981 stands as the most painful piece of evidence in the trial against the system. It proves that David Williams was not a blunt instrument by nature, but a musician forced to use his violin as a hammer. It begs the question, how much beauty was lost because the world demanded the beast? The audience loved the tiger, but few cared about David, the boy from Saskatchewan who just wanted to play hockey. The system wanted a monster, so it crushed the man to build one. The legacy of Tiger Williams is complex. It is uncomfortable. He is not a hero in the traditional sanitized sense. He hurt people. He ended careers. He was a willing participant in a brutal culture. We cannot wash away the blood on his hands, but neither can we deny him his humanity. Today, if you see him, you will see a man who carries the history of the game in his gait. He walks with the stiffness of a veteran. The scars on his face are a roadmap of the 1970s and 80s. But look at his eyes. The tiger is gone. The yellow feral light that used to burn in them has faded. In its place is the calm, slightly weary look of a survivor. He has done the hardest thing a man can do. He has outlived his own legend. He has climbed out of the bottle. He has climbed out of the void. He has rebuilt a life from the wreckage of his career. He is a husband. He is a father. He is a grandfather. He is David. And perhaps that is the only victory that matters. The system tried to turn him into a machine. It tried to use him up and throw him away. It tried to leave him broken and addicted in the dark. But it failed. He is still here. He is battered, yes. He is in pain, certainly. He carries the weight of 3,966 minutes on his back every single day. But he is standing. As the lights go down in the arena and the ghosts of the Maple Leaf Gardens fade into the past, we are left with the final image not of a penalty box, but of a frozen pond in Weyburn, Saskatchewan. The wind is howling across the prairie. The snow is drifting over the ice, and there, alone under the vast, indifferent sky, is a young boy skating. He is not fighting. He is not hitting. He is simply skating with the puck on his stick, moving with grace, moving with joy, moving toward a net that is open and waiting. That is the David Williams who deserved to live. And against all odds, that is the David Williams who survived the Tiger. The receipt has been paid in full. The debt is settled. The machine is silent. And the man is finally free.